This is a new talk, and although I've blended in some existing concerns and basically themes that I often explore, but it was really, I think it was triggered by a sort of recent spate of numerology and obsession that I'm seeing in certain cases. We're always walking this very awkward line between being rigorous and following the numbers to the wrong place, if you like. Now just to make sure, yeah, okay, let's just do that. As you said, I'll reintroduce myself. There's written a couple of things. I have an interest in kind of development process and how we design and how we build. That level of detail as well also led me to edit this book a few years ago, and here's the new one, which came out just a few weeks ago, co-edited by me and Trisha G. And that's pretty much as much plugging as I'm going to do, except I run a page on Facebook that is a words and language page, Word Friday. I'm kind of interested in how we use words, the semantics of things, and that interest manifests itself in a number of different ways. It manifests itself in code. When I really try and understand people's meaning, I really encourage that. But it also, when we talk about the language of business, what are the languages, what are the words we're often using? And sometimes when we mislead ourselves with a kind of sort of pseudoscience with both our words and our numbers. So I thought I'd go and cull the sink of all human knowledge, Wikipedia, for some of my concerns. Sometimes we get absorbed by certain numbers, but don't push them through to see what they actually imply. And sometimes I see a certain numerology, any belief in the divine or mystical relationship between a number and one or more coinciding events. It's also the study of the numerical value of the letters in words, names, and ideas. It is often associated with paranormal alongside astrology and similar divinatory arts, which for some reason somebody has not added this to include agile development, because there's an awful lot of it about. There's also another one which occasionally I see. This one definitely is an Urban Dictionary one. Masturbation, although I encountered it before seeing its entry on Urban Dictionary. There's a few alternative ones. What pseudoscientists, cranks, and charlatans use to prove their self-indulgent theories. Now, the problem is here, we love the idea of science. I love the idea of science. Science is it allows me to explore certain questions. Not every question wants to be explored in this way. We were just talking in terms of book recommendations just now, and if you looked at the list, there was a beautiful mix of things that were fictional and joyful, things that were contemplative, they were suggestive, there were things there that were much more rigorous, and they had a very different story to tell. And science in this sense can be considered to be one of those stories that we tell when we want to really push beyond belief into something that is knowledge, something that I can observe, but I can also allow somebody else to observe the same thing. A belief is a different system that doesn't necessarily allow me, another person, to observe that. But one of the ways we can sometimes convince people in this frame is by the use of measurement. The problem is that as human beings, we narrow down our focus, and that becomes this central focus. We almost exclude everything else. And this is an interesting thing. A few years ago, I realized that one of the values that I find in a lot of agile development techniques, or a lot of things that fall under the agile umbrella, is that they are actually, and this is a dirty secret, it turns out that it's not, when you realize this, it makes a lot more sense. Most of it is attention management techniques. Why do we worry about the amount of work we have in progress? It's an attention management technique. Test-driven development, it's an attention management technique. Working in groups as opposed to working always individually, it's an attention management. All of these are about focusing. They recognize the possibility of everything, but there is a something that demands your attention. Now, by definition, it means that when you are focusing on something, the concept of focus, implicit in the concept of focus, is the idea that you're concentrating on one thing to the exclusion of others. You are ignoring something. By definition, you cannot have focus without defocusing or ignoring something else. And this becomes an obsession. I dug out this piece of The Guardian a few years ago. If there's one management platitude that should have been throttled at birth, it's what gets measured gets managed. It's not that it's not true, it is, but it is often misunderstood with disastrous consequences. The full proposition is what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure and manage it, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. And we see a lot of this. Occurring when people are dealing with things that are statistical. I see this with things when people propose A/B testing for things. I'm not saying A/B testing is bad, but let's put it this way. A few years ago, Facebook did this huge experiment on emotional contagion. I think it was around 2014, 2013. I quoted in one of my other talks where I talk about ethics. And they did this huge experiment. 700,000 people were ultimately involved. No consent was given. And it turns out that you can influence people's positive and negative mood. And there's a huge uproar. And then I remember putting on a slide, you do realize this is A/B testing. You are influencing whether or not you're emptying somebody's wallet to buy a product. It's exactly the same concept. And we need to be really, really careful with that. But similarly, there is a statistical question here. A lot of results from A/B tests. There's another technique known as AA testing, where you actually test the same thing on two different samples, and you see whether or not you're getting an artifact of the variation of data, or you're actually measuring something real. But we do love our numbers, and most people interpret numbers very, very simply. They see the number that is in front of them. They do not look at the distribution or anything like that, and then they close down on that, and it becomes harmful to the organization, to the team, to the product as a whole. Even worse is where we start setting objectives in terms of this. I'll talk about coverage later. I'll also talk about velocity. Goodhart's law is one of the terms that I explored on Word Friday a few years ago. Once a metric becomes a target, it loses its meaning as a measure. Named after Charles Goodhart, Professor of Economics at the LSE and former advisor to the Bank of England, 1975 observed any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. And this informs us that it is not that we don't wish to measure, it is what we do with the measurement and the context in which we place it that really matters. I can make an observation, but the minute I want to turn that observation into control, the game changes. And this idea of attention and focus, I think, is really important. Because let's go and look at Agile. I received this box a few years ago, and the tape was cut in a convenient location. I immediately got my camera out and started taking pictures of the box. Honestly, I can't remember what was in the box. It's not important. I'm like a child who is given a present, and actually the box and the wrapping are much more interesting than what's inside. However, this beautiful coincidence, there you go, a bit of numerology there. Beautiful coincidence allows me to explore the word agile. I'm very fond of noting a couple of things about it. One is it's an adjective, so it's a property of something. Therefore, it is an observation that you make upon something. That something is fast, it's slow, it's agile, it's red, it's green. These are observations you make upon a thing. It is not a thing in itself, unless you want to get into the philosophy of qualia, but we're not doing that tonight. It is not a thing in itself. So I can use it as a comparative. I can observe a team and I can say, well, they're more agile than they were 6 months ago, or that team is more agile than that. But it is also a quality I can apply to a code base. I can say that code base is more agile than that because I am able to move it quickly and easily, or more quickly and easily than the other code base. There's a responsiveness that's implicit in the idea. Now, there is an interesting thing here. When most people adopt this, they don't really get as far as the and. They kind of stop around here. Able to move quickly. Apparently 2 concepts is too much. We often focus on the thing. And agility has an implication in it which is not simply about speed, but for that we can go back to the early 90s, rapid application development. There's a metaphor where speed is hard coded in the name, rapid. There is no sense in which that is the same sense of moving easily. It is purely about observed speed. But this subtlety this is what we lose. Most teams that are doing agile are probably not particularly agile. But we also live in a time where people are saying, well, this becomes a mantra, move fast and break things. Now, Facebook, okay, granted I've chosen a somewhat suggestive font and color, You can find that on their press pack on their website. You can find out the details. They didn't coin this phrase. The phrase goes back to the 1950s. It's an engineering maxim, but it is part of the culture of speed that people have become very obsessed with, and therefore this becomes the thing that they measure. And in Agile circles, this generally gets termed velocity. Now, the term velocity was a lot of people associate it with Scrum. It's not originally a Scrum term. Likewise, user stories, a lot of people think are a Scrum concept. This all dates back to extreme programming. And Kent Beck originally used this term. I'm pretty sure it was Kent, not Ron Jeffries, who coined this term. And he used it in Extreme Programming Explained. It's a very attractive term. And that's fine. There's only one problem with it, is that velocity has an implication. Sometimes we use it casually to simply refer to a notion of speed, but there's a different implication that velocity actually is something that has direction. It is a vector quantity, not merely a scalar. Most organizations say that they're measuring velocity partly because it actually sounds better. Speed doesn't sound quite as impressive, simply because it's that old thing. If a word has origins that are Latin or Greek, it sounds more technical in English. Speed is of Anglo-Saxon origin, whereas velocity is of classical origin. So it sounds more formal, sounds more professional, sounds more impressive. But let's actually pick on this. Most organizations are reporting speed. They're not looking at velocity, but they should be. And in fact, the real point here is the implication that velocity is a magnitude with a direction. In what direction are we going? This matters absolutely hugely. This is it's one of those things that if you're measuring speed, this is utterly irrelevant if you are going in the wrong direction. I got stuck. I found myself going the wrong way around the ring road around Brussels many years ago, in the time before Google Maps and widely available sat-nav. I found myself heading in the wrong direction. That's the thing about ring roads. It's very easy to do, and the directions don't give you any sense because everywhere points to everywhere. And it was only when I realized the sun was in the wrong part of the sky. I have a poor sense of direction, but I have a basic sense of astronomy. I was heading in the wrong direction. I was heading north when I should have been heading south. And I was heading in the wrong direction at great speed. Honestly, I'd have been better off walking in the right direction. Most teams would be better off not paying any attention whatsoever to their speed. They need to focus on their direction. Are we going in the right direction? Are we building a product that is built well? Are we building what the customer wants? As opposed to, are we churning through story points? Have we got the throughput? Are we moving things across our Kanban board? Whichever way we're looking at it, you kind of need to pause and go, well, wait a minute, are we heading in the right direction? And that is huge. However, we measure speed. And we measure speed in very simple ways. It is the displacement with respect to time. And let's keep things simple. It's kind of GCSE simple. Displacement with respect to time. And we end up with things like burn down charts. And a burn down chart is a very provocative, it's actually quite a useful observation, but it is just an observation. It is very much looking through one squinted eye at a complex landscape. Well, one squinted eye with really bad eyesight through a complex landscape. You're seeing something, but you're definitely not seeing the whole of it. I've never really been, I always thought the burn down chart was quite a good idea, but only when paired with another chart, which for reasons of symmetry, I guess a lot of people call a burn up chart. But as I have an interest in space travel, I will say that burn up is really, really bad. You do not want that. And also, as a father of kids who've gone through having fevers when they were younger, burning up is really bad. It's a build-up chart. Let us be quite literally constructive. The only reason this is called a burn-down chart is because Jeff Sutherland once made an observation that it looks like the flight path approach of a phantom jet to an aircraft carrier. And Jeff was a phantom pilot. And that was known as the burn down, because literally you are burning down. So there's nothing technically brilliant or technically insightful in that name that relates to software. It was just a coincidence of the shape. So rather than call this a burn up chart, I call it a build up chart, and did so before I heard the term burn up. You can combine both of these visualizations and others in things like cumulative flow diagrams. However, I'm just going to stick with this one for the moment because it's a nice simple graph. It's got S, it plots against T. It's suspiciously a straight line. Most books show these as straight lines. Be suspicious about that. That's not how humans think or work. But there's the question. What does S stand for? Stuff. Somehow we are producing more stuff over time. Sometimes people can interpret S as stories. There are lots of different things. But one of the standardized commodities that we have ended up, and linguistic commodity, I mean, is the word value. People use the word value everywhere. And it is there's an appeal that is positive here. Because the contrast is normally, what if my developers just get obsessed and start just developing cool frameworks and stuff like that, but not really actually progressing the business? What do they use? Architecture-centric ways of constructing. So building purely from the bottom up first, or component by component, building it Lego brick style rather than slicing it. The Lego brick style might be incremental in one sense, but runs immense risk in terms of being able to end up in the right place at the right time. So the idea is that we use the word value to suggest that it's not that. The problem is the word value itself is a universe of meaning. It doesn't actually nail something down. When somebody says we are doing this with respect to value, they've actually said almost nothing in that step. That's almost a content-free statement because it relates to a number of questions that we might have. Value for whom? What kind of value? Value over what period of time? People clarify it by putting an adjective, business value. But again, is that over the short term or the long term? Those decisions look different, but people never say that. We are dealing with business value in the long term or the short term. Those decisions look different. Likewise to the stakeholders, this nebulous Buffy the Vampire Slayer term that we've got excited about using. A lot of people are stakeholders. We should enumerate them. That includes the developers. Or do we just use that as shorthand for shareholders, which is not the same as the directors or indeed the employees or the customers? That's customer value. But again, all of these are time frame questions as well. And then we go and say, well, we're going to have requirements. We're not just going to prioritize them by technical considerations. We're going to prioritize by business value. Now, this is where we hit not just a question of we've been misusing a few physics terms and been messing about with the numbers a little bit, because honestly, how do you measure your progress in this sense? A story point is a very abstract concept. So, this is not really science, but then we hit the one biggie, prioritize by business value. This is a standard mantra. And in fact, it took me years to understand that you can't do this. I'm going to say it right now. If you are prioritizing by business value, you are not prioritizing by business value. It is actually against the laws of physics, as in general relativity. You cannot do this because you do not know the business value. You have absolutely no idea. I mean, some people can get around this, but the only way you know the business value of a product is by going into the future and seeing what it was or what it will be. That's it. You cannot know the business value. And of course, as we know, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. In fact, this is often accredited to Niels Bohr, but it also helps highlight that prediction is particularly, it's very difficult, even including the past. We're not entirely sure it was Niels Bohr or somebody else. The point here is you cannot know the business value until you have the business value. It's just one of those, it's not a question of an unknowable, it's not an unknown unknown, it's actually unknowable until you arrive in the future. What you are dealing with is estimation. Now, that might sound like a slight linguistic quirk, but trust me, it sounds really different when people say, we are going to prioritize by our estimated business value. The minute you say that, what do you do with estimates? We have whole discussions about estimates in the Agile space, but the one thing we forgot was to estimate how do we rank estimates of prioritization of business value. We keep talking about time and developer tasks. We've completely taken the eye off the ball of the business. The business have no idea what the business value is. I mean, they might sound confident, but if you ask them what the business value is, they will normally give you a number, or they will say it's big. Value, when it comes to forecasting, follows a distribution. It's a probability distribution, which means it's a range, which means in many cases where one thing has a higher value than another, it doesn't necessarily. They have an overlap. And it may turn out that something has a low risk, in other words, a tight band of value, a tight range of value, whereas another one has potentially very high value, but has a really broad spread. So it's a much flattened distribution. So the first thing we need to do is really start adjusting our language. When you are prioritizing, this is not something separate to estimation. It is estimation, and therefore it deserves the same kind of caution that we give all other forms of estimation. I'm kind of looking forward to the idea that there might be a no priorities movement springing up fairly soon. But we have that. Now let's actually look at the units here, because I mentioned, how do we measure this stuff? Well, people use abstractions such as story points, or what Joshua Karyevsky said one of his clients used to call nuts, N-U-T, nebulous units of time. They would literally estimate in nuts. And there's a good intention here. The intention is that we remove ourselves from the perception of and the priming of using wall clock time, real calendar time, because with that is often an expectation. We don't simply offer that something will take a week or 2 weeks. We know that somebody else has in mind a target. So without realizing it, we start negotiating, which is not an estimate. It's a process of negotiation. And again, that's a miss. So here's a case where we use the word estimate where we shouldn't use the word estimate. That's a negotiation. An estimate is not a negotiation. But we slip easily into negotiation without realizing we've left the process of estimation. So the idea is that by using an abstract unit that is determined by ourselves, then we will, as it were, step back from that source of influence. The problem is, of course, though, it is just a proxy for speed, or rather, it's a proxy. We end up with S over T, just again being an approximation of speed. And you end up with the standard thing that people say, well, the story output's going up, or the story outputs, this team, their throughput is not as good as it was. All that you do there is you realize that you've created a system of value. Specifically, you've created a currency. And now what you have is inflation. This is what economics is all about. It's the understanding how humans relate to resources and scarcity of resources and the perception of what value these things have with respect to trade. And so you create an accidental currency. And a number of organizations accidentally find themselves in that and then convert straight back to real-time numbers. Now, this is kind of interesting because it also leads to the question, well, in many cases, it really is just a proxy for that. So let's actually throw a bit of science at this diagram. Standard thing that you are taught if you do a numerate subject, and I'm afraid, folks, if I'm going to exclude computer science from that one, and even half of mathematics, is do dimensional analysis. What are your units? Something with respect to time. You cannot multiply kilograms by seconds and expect meters, for example. Dimensional analysis is looking at the consistency, and it turns out that this is quite important. There are many cases where a number of famous equations, but more importantly, the things people have coded up actually fail dimensional analysis, which explains certain results. It also turns out, so that's time, that's your days into your sprint. If your story points are, if you're measuring your stories using this, then you're also using time. Story points are a proxy for time. So what you're actually doing is measuring time against time. And I remember the first time I really observed this, I hadn't thought about it, but I visited it was a company in Norway, and I was looking at the Scrum Master who's dutifully, they were going for like big charts, making sure everything was as physical as possible, and they were carefully for the day drawing on, let's see how many story points we've done and this, that, and the other, and he drew that down. In fact, it was made more poignant because there was a conversion to hours on the right-hand side of the board. And I said, you do realize you're plotting time against time? And he kind of paused for a moment. It's just like, looked at me. It's just like, oh. And I said, that's utilization. Or perhaps it's quality of estimation. In other words, how did we do against what we estimated? So in other words, it's not that this doesn't have value. It's just that it's not the thing that you probably wanted. You're not measuring value in any sense. in the sense of the business value or any short term or long term. What you're measuring is utilization of people, or you're measuring the quality of your estimation. And that's fantastic, but it doesn't actually relate to the product. The other thing is to step back from this obsession with speed and the subtlety that we're after. And I think this is important because I've noticed a lot of phrases incorporated. People start talking about doing things faster. Indeed, I was at a conference where I actually had this slide up, where I planned the slide. And this was, back in the days when you could travel. I visited a company in India. It's a big internal event. And I didn't realize the slogan for the event. It was basically better, faster, more. It was along those lines. And I kind of get up there with my slide saying, really, you shouldn't be using the word faster. It's so ingrained. Actually, there is an article, there is a contribution here in this book that does talk about, again, faster. I did decide I wasn't going to get into a discussion. That's the author's point of view. But there's a subtle difference here. Sooner, not faster. It's a huge difference. To arrive somewhere sooner requires knowledge, not haste. My favorite way of contrasting this is when my kids were younger. It was a case of, mum and dad's taxi. At the weekends, or during the holidays, I would run off. I would go off and do things with one child, take them to a party, or my wife would get a pair of shoes for the other, or whatever. Then we'd meet up somewhere, and I have it in mind a specific event at the Mall at Cribbs Causeway, just outside Bristol, where we met up. And then it's a case of like, okay, we've ended up with 2 cars, we've rendezvoused for lunch, we've eaten lunch, and we're going to go home. And the kids would sometimes say, okay, I'm going to go with mom, or I'm going to go with dad, and see who gets home, faster, or see who gets home sooner. Because it turns out I drive quite fast. I have the points off my license to prove it. But my wife always arrives sooner. I drive faster, but she drives sooner. She has a good sense of direction. I have a poor sense of direction. She has good knowledge of routes and good recall, whereas my navigation skills are quite poor in that sense. So therefore, sooner, not faster is an emphasis on the knowledge that a team needs. You are wanting to build up skill and knowledge through both reflecting on what you've done, but also understanding genuinely all the obstacles. Are we heading in the right direction? All of that stuff. It turns out that speed is our enemy in this sense. And there's a kind of a nice quote from Austin Kleon. He's an artist and has some really lovely insights. This is his 3rd book, and I recommend all 3 of them if you're looking for some good lockdown reading. And you will find, he's talking about the creative process. You will find this relates to the work of software, the work of companies, the work of any creative act. And in his latest book, Keep Going, it makes a good point. It's impossible to pay proper attention to your life if you are hurtling along at lightning speed. When your job is to see things other people don't, you have to slow down enough that you can actually look. And this struck a I'm going to stop reading and make a note of this quote immediately kind of note. Because in software development, that is what we do. It is to see the things that other people don't. It is to see beyond the surface, to see that somebody's concept of their own business domain in their head makes sense, but it's natural to them. But we need to sort of challenge it, poke around the corners, find those edge cases, clarify assumptions, things that are not necessarily obvious as assumptions to them. Likewise, when we deal with the code, the edge cases, the subtleties, all of these things, the assumptions we have about other people and the work that they are doing. The job is to see the things that other people don't. That software is all about the details. So this is really quite important when we start thinking about the numbers that we use. We can accidentally mislead ourselves in one of the most important respects, which leads to this paucity of time, this observation we have very bad time management. Now, I've seen some variations of this quote recently, and a lot of people have attributed it to 21st century. I do honestly recommend going to read Melvin Conway's original paper, How Do Committees Invent? It was published in 1968 in Datamation, and it is in a space of only a couple of pages is incredibly dense with history and possibility and insight that is still relevant over half a century on. He said, there's never enough time to do something right, but there's always enough time to do it over. And this is indeed the very same paper where he makes the observation that has become known as Conway's Law. And it's worth quoting Conway's Law because a lot of people get used to it and they think, if you've not encountered it, well, hello, welcome to Conway's Law. If you have encountered it, perhaps you've misunderstood it. The basic thesis is that organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. This is really important. It's to do with the communication structures. It's not necessarily the same as the organizational chart. The organizational chart is one of the forces on that. The physical location is another force, but there are other factors as well. People's personal friendships, trust levels, people's extroversion, introversion, whether they're smokers or not. Yeah, you know, the hidden smokers network that every company has. How do you know that person? Oh, they're a smoker and I see them outside. That kind of thing. One guy, a company I worked at years ago, if you wanted to get things done, he was the guy to go and see. Why? Because he'd worked in the two main divisions of the company for decades and basically knew everybody, knew how to get things done. But in the organizational chart, in the organogram, it wasn't obvious that Paul was significant. So the point here is that what are the communication structures? That's one aspect, but there's another aspect. We have found a criterion for the structuring of design organizations. A design effort should be organized according to the need for communication. I've seen this referred to in the last 10 years. People have said, oh, they've created a new thing called the inverse Conway or the reverse Conway maneuver. They only created it because they didn't read the original paper. Conway was not talking about the fact that your system will become a victim to your communication paths. He was actually using it constructively. His thesis was that you should change your structures in order to achieve particular architectures. That's the so-called reverse Conway maneuver. No, it's the Conway maneuver. It's all there. But this question of organization is one of those other issues where we keep falling back into bad maths. So let's kind of explore another one of the obsessions that we see in the Agile space. What is that obsession? Scale. Whether we're talking safe or less or anything else, scale. We have become obsessed with scale. And this is an interesting one because this is another hidden assumption here in terms of our language, and we then betray it with numbers. Sometimes people say we need to scale. You know what? I think most of the time people say that, they are 100% correct. But the question you need to ask them is, did you mean up or down? Because scale has two directions. We scale up or we scale down. There's a silent assumption that we mean up. Challenge that assumption. Because in other domains, that's not the way the word scale is used. In the domain of CrossFit, my son used to do CrossFit, and the word scale is used, but it means exactly the opposite. You scale down. You scale an exercise down. If you've suffered injury or if you're not yet fit enough or you're unfamiliar with an exercise or for other reasons of ability, you can't do the full exercise, but you want the reps. You want to get the repetitions in. You scale the exercise, and that means you scale it down. If you can't do full press-ups, then angle off the knees instead of your feet. That's scaling, okay? Scale in that domain, when people say I scaled the exercise, they mean scale down. And we need to do a lot more of that. Observation from Alan Kelly is that software development does not have economies of scale. It's an informational thing. It's not a physical manufacturing discipline. It's an informational thing, which means we end up with diseconomies of scale. And we can actually derive this from first principles. Which I remember being shown a particular graph a number of years ago. I've lost the original paper. It was really good. So I tried to derive it and discovered I actually derived something else that went beyond what the original paper had done. And I believe we'll see that coming out. So let's use a baseline. And I'm going to say that I'm doing massive idealization here. This is simply a thought experiment and should not be mistaken for a graph that you can come and measure off or an equation that you should apply with infinite rigor. Let's take a baseline. Here is the time. T1 is the completion time for one person. to do to develop a software product or a release for a software product. And when I say completion time, I mean all of the tasks. If there's BA work to be done, that person's doing it. System testing, they're doing it. Software development, they're doing it. All of the activities. Well, how long does it take one person? That's our baseline. Then somebody goes and reads Adam Smith, division of labor. Brilliant. 2 people, half the time. 3 people, a third of the time. Yeah, but that's too easy, isn't it? It starts getting messy, because it turns out that unless you are doing something that is actually quite boring and relatively trivial, there will be interdependencies. The work that you do will rely on the work that other people do, and that you are literally constructing things. You will need some level of interference. Now, let's use a different word, coordination. But there is a coordination cost. You cannot do everything in parallel unless the task is actually quite uninteresting. So there is a coordination cost. In the worst cases, it becomes a genuine interference cost. And so the proportion you can do in parallel, and this lies between 0 and 1. It turns out this is the same as we use for calculating the degree of parallelism that you can squeeze out of an application. This is Amdahl's law. But it's also a reminder, this is an idealization. Human beings are not like processor cores. We are doing this to explore the numbers and explore the implications. But we're not done yet. There's more brackets. There is the question of connections and communication. There is another communication overhead. Basically this tells us that the lean people are right, reduce your work in process. This talks about team structure. So this is more process and this is a little more structure. It's not a perfect match, but this will be more to do with your team and your architecture and the shape of your architecture. In the worst case, everybody needs to talk to everybody else. I use the term talk perhaps a little more generally than I should do, communicate, because writing code is a form of communication. Having a merge conflict is having a bit of a disagreement about the conversation. All of these are forms of communication. All forms of communication. We've been talking email, face-to-face conversations, stand-ups, meetings, workshops, pairing, all of these. And we realize that all of these are there. In the worst case, our architecture requires everybody to talk to everybody else. And there is an overhead associated with that. Now it's a bit late in the evening, so let's draw graphs. That's the graph. That's the graph we're interested in. The one that says, if I have no people, this will take infinite time. That's an intuitive result. I'm cool with that. And as we add people, things will speed up. And then we will reach an optimal point beyond which things start slowing down when we add people. If you like, this is the anticipation. The Brooks's law, adding more people to a late project makes it later. Well, what we're seeing here is actually this is one of the ways to make a project late in the first case. Because this line is not smooth and it's not visible, you don't always know where you are on it. You can't always tell. It'd be really easy if you said, well, let's remove a person from the team. Oh, we went down the slope by this gradient. That would be nice and easy. And I'm sure there are people out there trying to do that, but it's not a smooth distribution. It's not smooth, it's lumpy. And it takes time to settle. I've shown you an equilibrium idealized state. And this is where a lot of companies operate. They operate over here. This is your big consultancies. We're going to put lots of people on it and we'll charge you for the people. Whereas actually, if we reduced and scaled down, it's got to be a careful scaling down. You cannot take a system that has been created at this scale and simply half the number of people. You're pulling its infrastructure from beneath it. You need to scale down carefully. You've reached a point where it actually needs that many people to keep it alive. But this is really important because it also betrays some of the bad science that we end up doing in other cases, where somebody will say, well, we've got a new project and we're going to create a new product this year. And we had 60 people on that other one 2 years ago, and that wasn't, that took too long. So, that was not enough people. And what you realize is that we're going to add 80 people here. What you're doing is you're going up this way, whereas the real observation should be, let's reduce, or let's start small and grow and just sense our way through. But there's an interesting thing here that relates to the fulfillment and size and scale. This is from 2015. I'm sure Facebook still has this problem. I mean, every now and then I'm sure they take time off from destroying democracy and actually write some code. And they probably ported all of this to Swift. But the Facebook iOS app over 18,000 Objective-C classes. I actually ran this as an estimation exercise once informally in a workshop, and one person did say 18,000, but they said 18,000 lines. What are 18,000 classes doing on the client? Now, people often think, oh, it's the analytics that Facebook do. No, that's at the back end. What's 18,000 doing on a client? And actually, that's not really the problem. And I used to approach it from this side. Oh my goodness, you've got so much code. But you need to look at the second part of the sentence. In a single week, there are over 400 people contributing to it. Actually, we've been looking at this the wrong way. You have to ask yourself, would it be possible to create a small application with over 400 people contributing to it? And I think the answer is absolutely no. I think it's almost impossible. And so, for example, if I look at the call, we've got, what have we got? There's a number here that says 60. So we've got 60 people. We've got 60 people here. How could, if I said our challenge this evening is to create a Hello World program with 60 people, I'm pretty sure we couldn't do a small one. Or rather, the best way to do that would be to send 58 people away and have 2 people pair on the Hello World solution, and that would be it. The problem is it's almost impossible to create a small application with over 400 people. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is the root of so many problems. Now, even independent of that, we start messing with the second law of thermodynamics here. If an evolving program is continually changed, its complexity, reflecting deteriorating structure, increases and less work is done to maintain or reduce it. Now, there's 2 observations I want to make about this. This is Meyer Lehman, classic paper, Program Life Cycles and Laws of Software Evolution from 1980. So it's 4 decades old. This is 12 years before Ward Cunningham coined the technical debt metaphor. But that observation was already present and visible at the beginning of the 80s. We hadn't even entered properly the PC era or anything like that. People had modest level of experience with large-scale, what we would now consider large-scale software applications. In fact, they all had almost no experience at that point. But there is a point here that this is inevitable unless work is done. There's actually quite a nice parallel with the physics here. If you regard this as entropy, you can decrease the entropy or increase the order of a system by putting work in. But what is interesting here is a very subtle thing, and I missed it the first time round, the word maintain. This actually is maintenance. Most of what we call maintenance in software development is not maintenance. It is continued development. Fixing a bug is not maintenance. That's actually putting a feature back in that was supposed to be there. Adding small features is also not maintenance. Porting is not maintenance. These are continued development. But this idea of the deterioration, that's actually the real world metaphor, is deterioration of structure through, as it were, wear and tear. In one case physical, in another case virtual. But I mentioned technical debt. And technical debt, invented by Ward Cunningham in 1992, captured as an idea, actually to explain to one of his clients the work that he was doing. And he used the debt metaphor because his client was in finance. And Martin notes technical debt is a wonderful metaphor developed by Ward Cunningham to help us think about this problem. So Martin helped popularize technical debt. And this is his 2004 blog, if I remember correctly. And he said, like financial debt, the technical debt incurs interest payments, which come in the form of extra effort that we have to do in future development because of the quick and dirty design choice. And there's loads that has been written about this. But I'm going to go right back to the first sentence I quoted. It's a metaphor. That matters. That matters hugely. It is a metaphor, which means that it should not be taken literally. A metaphor is a way that is a technique for when we consciously employ it to draw a parallel, to allow, it's a mapping, to allow somebody to understand something in terms of something else. A good metaphor is one that says, here is this thing that is complex and perhaps abstract and you're not familiar with or difficult to grasp. What happens to software over time? Here's a concept you are familiar with, financial debt. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw parallels between these. I'm going to use the metaphor, use the thing you understand to illuminate the thing that you do not. And this is really important because it helps us characterize what a good metaphor is. It requires a relatively faithful mapping, but it also requires familiarity with this. There's a really nice piece by Steve Freeman on a better metaphor for technical debt, and it relates to financial instruments, particularly derivatives and put options and so on. There's only one problem. It's a terrible metaphor for most people because most people do not understand derivatives trading. And honestly, I don't think, based on the last 10 or 15 years, that the city really understands derivatives trading. Apparently, the global economy is worth quadrillions, and that's mostly to do with this fiction based on derivatives trading. So it's mostly funny money. And so therefore, using a thing that relatively few people understand to try and explain a thing that probably actually more people understand software structure than understand derivatives trading is probably the wrong way around. But financial debt, that's good. Entropy is not bad, but perhaps you need to have a background in information theory or physics to really properly appreciate it. So debt is something that everybody has a familiarity with, but it is a metaphor. And one of the biggest dangers I've seen, and this is just a few weeks ago, found myself again cautioning against the category error of treating technical debt metaphor literally and numerically. The thing, and it was popularized by Sonar and a number of others, converting code quality into a currency value on a dashboard. So you've got it in pounds or euros or dollars or whatever, and saying we have this much technical debt. Rarely has so much bad science been compressed into one dashboard entry. It's not even close to being a real value. Even if you could estimate it, and we've already had the conversation about estimation, even if you could estimate it, it is unlikely you'd still be getting it wrong, because a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, this is the cost of repaying the debt. That is not how debt works. The way that debt is managed as a financial instrument, debt is the cost of owning the debt. It is not the cost of repayment. A lot of people talk about the debt as if it were the repayment cost. That's not it. It turns out that when you are dealing with a software system, and remember your software system is a socio-technical system, there are human beings, there's software, there's many parts to your software, it has dependencies, and that means it's a complex financial instrument. It is not done simply as I owe you a fiver. That is exactly how it isn't. So the false science that goes into when people convert it into a currency value, as I said, first of all, you need to have good estimates. Then you need to appreciate that estimates have error bars. But even then, you've not fully appreciated the complexity of it. It's a metaphor. Leave it at that. Do not turn it into numbers. That's just fake science. But how good are we at estimating, and how good are we with currencies? Well, here's a quote from New Scientist a few years back. Coming out of the financial crisis that was triggered by some incredibly bad complex financial instruments, which when we look at in hindsight, it's kind of obvious they weren't going to work. I think the three of the best documented tenets of economic psychology can help explain why we collectively took on the loans that events approved were so unwise. First is materialism. Well, we don't have that as a big problem in software. Second is money. Again, people in software are mostly rewarded by the work that they do. I'm not saying they don't need money, but they're not. You find that people who are software developers have a different motivation model to people who are in sales. These attract very different people and very different models. But the one that they all share is this one, that we have the most spectacular deviation from rationality. The massive myopia with which we approach choices between good things that will arrive at different points in the future. Humans are quite hopeless at such intertemporal choice, consistently choosing to take small benefits sooner rather than large benefits later. Now, that is a great phrase to drop into a conversation, intertemporal choice. We are bad at intertemporal choice. This book by Gary Marcus, he did a talk for Festival of Ideas here in Bristol in 2008, if I remember correctly. I went to see him. Kluge, the haphazard evolution of the human mind. And he looked at this one. In every species that's ever been studied, animals tend to follow what is known as a hyperbolic discounting curve. Again, another one to drop in conversation. Fancy words for the fact that organisms tend to value the present far more than the future. And the closer the temptation is, the harder it is to resist. People assume either the simple models that people tend to assume for how we value things is flat value profile, a linear amortizing line, or an exponential drop. But hyperbolic is ultra extreme. And unfortunately, that's the way that we reason. We are very poor at doing that. And this explains why some of the trade-offs that you constantly get teams saying, this false dichotomy of we don't have time to work on technical debt because we need to work on features. Where did you think that time went, and where do you think it's coming from? These are the same kind of time. It's not an either or. It's as if somehow prettying your code, that's all you're doing when you're refactoring. It's like, no, you're actually changing the nature of the knowledge as it is expressed in the system so that other people can work. You are changing potentially something by orders of magnitude. When you do that, the wins are obvious, but it's really hard to track because it's based on hypotheticals. It's based on probabilities. If we were to do this, then perhaps we would save this. It's a very difficult thing to measure. It's not impossible, but you have to be quite cautious and quite canny about it. So general advice here, let's move slow and mend things. And one of the best techniques for moving slowly is testing. Testing is a caution, a way of causing you to deliberate, but it's also a way of speeding up. We speed up over different time horizons. You work slowly in the present, but you work fast, if you like, and therefore arrive sooner in the larger time scale. What is it that we measure about testing? There's only one candidate. Tests, tell me your coverage. So Martin has this: from time to time I hear people asking what value of test coverage, also called code coverage, they should aim for, or stating their coverage levels with pride. Such statements miss the point. In the same blog post, Brian Marrick, whose background is in testing, he made a point: I expect a high level of coverage. Sometimes managers require one. There's a subtle difference. This goes right back to the Goodhart's law observation right at the beginning. And this is really important. Coverage is an observation, but it's also a demonstration of how we create problems for ourselves. So let me just use casually 100% coverage. Do you know how easy it is to get 100% coverage? It's trivial. It is absolutely trivial. People make such a big deal about it. It really is not very hard. You just have to do one thing. You start writing the test before you write the code, or you write your test as you write your code, or you write your test soon after. In other words, if you are doing that, when the needle drops below 100, you know something's wrong. In fact, a friend of mine, John Jagger, he runs a Cyber Dojo, coding dojo site, and John has 100% code coverage, and John keeps it at 100%. He says it's absolutely trivial to keep the thing at 100%. This software has been evolving for 10 years. And he says because it's always at 100, you notice when the needle moves off. You don't aim for 100. It's just where you are. Once you're at 100, it's trivial. And he says the minute the needle drops, he knows what's wrong. It means there's dead code. That's what it means. Suddenly, instead of aspiring from the bottom of a pit where we had 1% coverage, we get to 100% coverage, immediate dead code detection. And I was interviewed about this a couple of years ago. What suggestions do you have for dealing with dead code? Find it, delete it. People think deleting code is a big problem. It's not a technical problem. It's a psychological problem. It's mindset, it's culture, and it's also tooling and where we've got to. But there is an interesting idea here when we start talking about things like a test-first approach. This idea is that people who use test-driven development don't generally worry about coverage because they always have it. It's just there. It's just a green indicator. It's just, yep, we're still pretty high. That's it. You're always going to get high. It might not be 100. There are actually cases where you don't want, certainly if you don't want to test, that are used for diagnostics. You don't want to bake that into your testing suite. But you really want something incredibly high. And once it's there, you keep it there because why wouldn't you? And how could you not do that? We only create this problem because we're too busy making shortcuts. And we say that there are all these other problems. They come about simply because we didn't go slow enough to get fast. And we become distracted by the wrong numbers. Now, this idea of test first is not a new one. The earliest entry I found for it, earliest reference, is Alfred Aho talking about the awk programming language. This is the 1970s. We instituted a rigorous regression test for all of the features. Any of the three of us, Aho, Weinberg, and Kernighan, the three who developed awk, who put in a new feature into the language, first had to write a test for the new feature. Now, this is also interesting because it also gives us a rather curious idea, and probably beloved of football managers, the idea of 110%, but I'm going to moderate that down to 101%. Football managers love to say the team gave 110%, but this is a really interesting idea. If you take a test-first approach, what you are doing is you have more test coverage than you have code. That's why it doesn't pass. You've asked for more than there is. You have covered more than we have fulfilled. If you always keep the needle above 100%, in other words, if you frequently nudge it, in other words, it goes red because you've asked for something that's not there, keeping it at 100 is trivial. But I've been pulling a fast one on you. I've been using the word coverage as if there were no ambiguity there. Martin used the word coverage. Brian used the word coverage, and he's a professional tester. He should know better. Coverage is another one of those words that needs clarification, like scale. You need to put another word with it, scale up or scale down. When people talk about 100% coverage, they are talking about one of the most trivial forms of coverage you can ever reach, statement coverage. That basically means I touched every statement at least once. It doesn't talk anything about the logic and the paths and control flow in your code. Branch coverage, now that's harder. Condition coverage, oh, that's even harder. People don't generally report these, one, because they're harder to measure, and two, because you're going to find it really hard to hit 100%. So we choose the thing we can easily measure, and we measure by that, and we call it coverage as if there were no other form of coverage. When somebody uses the term coverage, just a gentle reminder, just to clarify, you mean statement coverage, because it's a reminder that you haven't, even if you've got high levels of coverage, you probably have low levels of coverage. It's a reminder there. But it also gets us away from a particular area. So I'm going to kind of make a couple of observations where people start making trade-offs between integration and unit testing. And I think this is quite an interesting one. The paper published 6 years ago. It's one of those. I love this paper for a number of reasons. One of which is its title. It's one of those tells you everything you need to know titles. Simple testing can prevent most critical failures, an analysis of production failures in distributed data-intensive systems. And it does a survey on a number of open source systems. Makes the observation that, hey, guess what? Most people test the happy day scenarios. Who knew? And that most of the errors that are found are on the least well-trodden paths, the error handling paths. But for me, what struck me was this observation from the numbers. A majority of the production failures, over 3/4, can be reproduced by a unit test. Now, that doesn't mean we could necessarily find them in advance, because sometimes we don't have the knowledge to do so. But these are systems that have not been explicitly designed for unit testing, have not been explicitly designed using a test-driven development approach or necessarily even an agile approach. They're open source, so there's a certain fluidity, and many minds make bugs shallow. But at the same time, that may not have been a driven approach. They weren't developed using XP or anything like that. And yet we're able to hit this high number just with a unit test. And this is important because I keep hearing people say, oh, well, we're kind of pulling back on doing unit tests. We're going to go for integration tests. Perhaps if you're doing a certain very fine-grained microservices architecture, there's a reasonable case to be made for that. But in many cases, that's not what's going on. And J.B. Rainsberger pulled no punches in a talk and a blog post he wrote on this a few years ago. Integrated tests are a scam, a self-replicating virus that threatens to infect your code base, your project, and your team with endless pain and suffering. Come on, JB, tell us what you're thinking. I do recommend reading the piece or watching the talk. It's very clear, because what he's talking about, the combination, he's talking about the combinatrix. This is not a new idea. Book published in 1979, one of the kind of the gospels of software testing, the art of software testing. Blenford Myers, module testing or unit testing is a way of managing the combinatrix of testing, since the attention is initially focused on the small building blocks of the program. You will never, ever achieve the kind of coverage with integration testing that you can with unit testing. Never. You will need a team that is so large and need to have so long to do it that you will be fooling yourself. On the other hand, you can probably achieve high statement coverage using integration testing and fool yourself into believing that you're doing that, rather than refactoring the architecture. And in a somewhat misguided, so I'll close with a somewhat misguided paper by Jim Kevlin. I quote this because many people quote it back at me and say, what do you think about what Jim Kevlin said? I've known Cope for a number of years, and yeah, he's got a gripe against unit testing, mostly because he has a gripe against Kent Beck, but that's a different story, and I don't want to indulge in an ad hominem attack here. First of all, one of the observations in his paper is he's trying to make a case for unit testing being a waste, and actually teams should spend more time doing integration testing. He's not looked at the combinatrix of it. But here's this interesting one, and this one to me is interesting because as somebody, I do technical coaching, I do workshops, I do courses on test-driven development, and first statement is an interesting one. If you want to reduce your test mass, I'm going to first of all observe that's a luxury problem. Most people don't sit there going like, we have too many tests. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that that's not a common problem. However, if you want to reduce your test mass, the number one thing you should do is look at the tests that have never failed in a year and consider throwing them away. They are producing no information for you, or at least very little information. This is a little bit like Trump's recent observation that you get a lot fewer coronavirus cases if you don't test for them. Yes, it's a very simple idea here, and I'm going to recommend that you have more than one idea. Nothing is more dangerous than an idea when you have only one idea. I think this is a good one for life as well as for software. Virginia Satir observed, to have one choice is no choice, to have two choices is a dilemma, to have three choices offers new possibilities. And the late Jerry Weinberg observed, if you can't think of three things that might go wrong with your plans, then there's something wrong with your thinking. So what is the information that a test that has not failed for a year giving me? Why should I not get rid of it? One, your tests are not failing because the code they are testing has not changed. This is really important to understand that how code changes. Code tends to follow a particular life cycle. Initially, after checking, that you're likely to get a flurry of changes, and then it's likely to stabilize into its future pattern. And code across a code base does not all change at the same rate. In fact, it follows a power law distribution, or at least a highly skewed distribution, but normally it's modeled as a power law distribution. There's some code that changes a lot and very frequently, and then there's a lot of code that doesn't change for a long time and is incredibly stable. That is what your tests are telling you. If you need to back it, your test might be telling you that. If you need to back it up, I strongly recommend looking at Adam Thornhill's book, Your Code as a Crime Scene. This is a really good book on code analytics. Look at your code. Your code base is a knowledge base. It has its history in it. You can find out. And so, in other words, if your tests are not failing, it may well be that that's an indicator of stability. Oh, this one from one of my clients for a few years ago. Your tests are not failing because they are not running. Oops. Turns out they were kind of commented out in a script, and therefore there were no, there are a lot fewer reds these days. That's because we're running a lot fewer of the tests. There's whole sections of testing not being run. And honestly, sometimes you really are that good. Your tests are not failing because actually, yes, you are that good. So honestly, do not do this kind of numerology-driven kind of development. Interrogate the numbers. Accountant and historian of accounting H. Thomas Johnson, perhaps what you measure is what you get. More likely what you measure is all you'll get. What you don't or can't measure is lost. We need to be careful. It's not that we don't wish to measure things, but we need to do so with appropriate humility and context, and a little bit of skepticism every now and then. We need to understand that where we draw an analogy or a metaphor, that perhaps there is something more to it, but perhaps there isn't, and perhaps the metaphor took us as far as we can go. We need to understand that if we become wed to a number that is the simplest of the class of its domain, like coverage, for example, and statement coverage, the simplest of its class, that perhaps we are hiding or not seeing some of the greater complexity when that number goes high and stabilizes. We also need to understand that some of the other numbers, they do have a value, and how to get them is we are making things hard for ourselves by not appreciating the aspects of process and practice that lead to that. I would say that is all I'm going to say on the matter, but that would be an absolute lie. That is all I am going to say on the matter at this point. So I think we've got time for questions, and that was so yeah, that wasn't too bad timing wise. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, so we've got time for questions. I don't know if there are any questions or observations in the.
There's been several observations in the chat panel. I think, but finishing off with it, like Dan's been very chatty, but has asked a question there. So, but Dan, do you want to ask that in person, or? Yeah,
let's have real people questions.
Real people questions.
Yeah, so I need to know that you're not a bot. You know, I'm only talking to real people today.
So yeah, Kevlin, we've worked together a little bit. I've had you for training and things in the past.
Absolutely, yes.
We're going, I guess the journey we're on is that, and I think many organizations are in this, is that you have the kind of business service sort of relationship where they give you the solution and then they just measure you on speed. But I think where we're going to actually is quite good, is that they're talking about the idea of an investment board. So, you know, anyone with a business concept goes to it, talks about the risk, the outcomes they're looking for, and then we start to really engage in, well, what is the business benefit? Not necessarily being some random number that you can attach to it, but what are the kind of key levers you're looking at? So that's kind of one area. And then the other area I'm thinking more about is moving away from just the general concept of flow, which I think is important that we keep that, but actually more to how do we understand that we're breaking stuff down? So rather than thinking about things in these, right, we've got this 6-month project, but it's actually, you know, we're going to deliver this thing in a month and it's going to give you answers to these questions and it's going to show you kind of these answers. I just wondered, have you got any thoughts about how you engage with the business on that journey, around like ideas we could use, books you could read, anything like that, really?
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, because I think it sounds like what you're doing is what it kind of relates to that observation about having offering 3 ideas, because I think one of the things we get trapped in is not just our simple numbers and our simple words, but the idea of, we're going to sell you, here it is. So I'm going to ask you to experiment with the business, you know, to run it. Literally, what works in one organization may absolutely not work in another, because people are people and there are subtleties to the situation. So what you're trying to do is find out, how do we make this work? What are the levers I need to push? What are the things that I show that get the greatest feedback? And one of the simplest ones that I've kind of encouraged people to do is to not sort of withdraw and say, we can't tell you anything because we shouldn't give you numbers or whatever, or we can't give you estimates because that's not the agile way, or all kinds of stuff. We can't tell you when. It's like, no, absolutely you can, but just give me 3 scenarios. You know, this is basically risk modeling. Let me give you 3 scenarios here. I'm going to give you, if it all works out this way. So in other words, what I do is I covertly give you numbers, but what I do is I run 3. The implication of 3 is that there are many. And what you do is you show somebody the 3 possible futures. And the one I often joke about, I have a whole spiel on sat navs and stuff like that, it occurred to me years ago when it was a company, when it was about 5 years ago, a company in Belfast, and they showed me a roadmap. And it was only when they said that, I suddenly thought, your roadmap's only got 1 road on it. And it never occurred to me that that's the most pointless map you could ever have. It means you're in a desert. The only thing that's worthwhile is knowing the distance to the next petrol station. You are in a desert. There is nothing interesting. You don't need a map. The reason that we have maps is so that we can see the alternative routes. But now, thanks to things like Google Maps and so on, it becomes a little more real, because if you take this route, there's a traffic jam on that route. This route will be 5. It turns out that it's 5 minutes faster. Previously, it's 5 minutes slower. In other words, it's dynamic. What you're doing is you're showing people, here are 3 possibilities at this point in time. We reckon this one's going to take this kind of time. This one, there's a bit of risk here. I mean, we could get lucky, but there's a bunch of technology we've not yet used. So in the worst case, we're actually going to find that we're mired in technical problems. But if we're really lucky and the framework does everything that's promised, then this might be delivered early. So in other words, this has a wide distribution. This one is confident and narrow, but it takes about this amount of time, and so on. So in other words, by simply being honest and offering scenarios and alternatives, I think that is the way that allows us to remind ourselves of, the numbers can be helpful, but we have enough wriggle room to get them wrong. And we don't have to be perfect with the numbers, and we don't have to avoid the numbers. We can just say, look, here's these things. And I think that alternative scenario modeling in some industries is used a lot more than we use it in software. Advertising campaigns and things like that. Typically, people will say, look, here are 2 or 3 alternatives that we thought for your advertising campaign, and we show you the 3 different approaches, the 3 different new logos. Here, you don't. I know we often love to make fun of companies' logos. They paid $100,000 for that. I could have done that. I could have done that in Gmail and with the right fonts. That's it. But and I don't want to belittle them too much, but there is a point there that normally those campaigns are based on, let us show you and do a rough mock-up of multiple scenarios. And that, I think, is the bit that Agile, this is the set-based thinking that is sometimes talked about in lean development, but not talked about enough. We offer people points when we should be offering them sets.
Cool. Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Other thoughts and questions? Ben, you've been missold. I'm happy to have made sure that you got the right product ultimately. Anything else? Value is more often than not intangible. Yes, so we fall back into measuring. So with this one, David, we fall back into measuring what is tangible. Output speed in medicine, we have the concept of health. It cannot be measured, but we still have a science to get better health. Can we apply? Do you know, that's a really good parallel. That also tells us the kind of conversation that we want to have. In medicine, I can do a number of things. I can measure blood pressure. I can measure BMI. There's a number of other points that I can make. But if a doctor, if you have a health assessment, it doesn't necessarily need to be a doctor, but if you have a health assessment, it will be a set of things, any one of which is neither individually right or wrong, but paints a broader picture. But there is also the qualitative discussion and the confidential discussions, and really, and how much do you smoke type questions, and these kinds of things, and how much do you actually drink? And they always, by the way, they always estimate up. And it's a standard technique in the medical profession. You double the units that anybody gives you. But what they try and do is they build up a whole picture, recognizing that an individual measure will be fallible. It's not that we can't measure things. It's just, it goes back to what I said. It's what we do with the measure. We tend to invest too much in single numbers rather than saying, here's a sample. And that allows us to be wrong. It doesn't, maybe we do measure, yeah, that's fine. That team's measuring speed, but they've also got these other factors that are of interest. In other words, it allows us to be a little more approximate. It builds up a picture. It's almost a pointless approach to health. And you can get a general sense of that. And you're right, there isn't a single number that portrays health, but an expert will normally look at a number of factors, and there are certain outliers. There are certain things that go, oh, that's not good. And if they have time-based data as well, since your last checkup, suddenly they're able to build a more complex picture. And let's put it this way, software development is not simpler than that. So we should approach it with that kind of same breadth. So yeah, feel free to measure. It's just our attachment to measures, but sometimes we want so much of them, we make them mean things that they're not. I think that's really the lesson. Statement coverage is absolutely fine, but just take it into account. It's statement coverage, and there's a bunch of other things that you might also be interested in. Statement coverage with respect to rate of change. Where's the defect density? Where do your tests concentrate? These are heat maps, and they take you much, much further. And so even at that level, we see that the story is more complex. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, we probably have time for one more question. Who's bursting to ask a last question?
That'd be a big no one. Go on.
If not, we're just kind of like approaching 8 o'clock. We've just got a minute to go. So let's let that time is something we can measure, and let's maybe just take the opportunity to wrap up bang on time. But just before we go, one last kind of thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's come along to enjoy tonight's meeting. But a big thank you to Kevlin for coming along and sharing some really fascinating points. Thanks very much, Kevlin.
Thank you very much.
Try not to. See everyone. Hopefully next month. We are still working on the plans for next month's meeting. Have a look. Keep an eye out on the meetup site. So hopefully see you again next month. Evening,
nice
everyone.
One.
Cheers.
Lovely to see you all. Ciao, ciao.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
Yves, your point about your father and the stress. That's a good one. The stress level, I think, is really interesting. People who are going much faster are more stressed. And trust me, the way I used to drive, I was always more stressed.
Yeah, your story reminded me of that, indeed.
Yeah, so there is a deep truth in that. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye bye.